The Arizona Territory stretched wild and merciless under a blood-red dawn. Ezra McKinnon woke to cold steel. It was pressed hard against his throat, a final, cold period at the end of a long, lonely sentence. 58 years old. 15 of those years spent in a silence so deep you could hear your own heart break. He was a former Union cavalryman, a man who'd seen the elephant and wished he hadn't. Now he just wanted to be left alone with his cattle, his whiskey, and the ghost that whispered in the desert wind. But the world had found him anyway. 3 women stood over his bed, not maidens from some dime novel, warriors. Their buckskin clothes were ripped and stained from hard travel, their hands calloused around the stocks of heavy rifles. Their dark eyes held the kind of secrets that get men killed. The eldest, maybe 26, had a dark stain spreading across her shirt. A fresh wound, a bad one. He could smell the blood, copper, and rust, a scent he knew better than his own name. While he slept, they'd tied his wrists with rawhide cord. The knots were tight, professional. These weren't scared girls making a mistake. These were survivors, the kind of women who learned that mercy was a story you told children, not a tool you used to stay alive. The one with the wound spoke. Her voice was low, raspy, but her English was clear, sharpened on the cruel stone of a dying world. "You will help us," she said. The rifle in her hand didn't waver. "Or you will die here." Ezra McKinnon had faced down cannon fire and cholera, blizzards and banditos. But in the quiet of his own cabin, had he finally met his end? He didn't beg. Men like Ezra had all the pleas burned out of them at places like Antietam and Gettysburg. Begging was for men who still believed someone was listening. Instead, he studied the woman's face. High cheekbones, sharp enough to cut a man's pride to ribbons. A thin sheen of sweat on her brow, glistening in the faint morning light, even though the cabin was cold enough to see your breath. That wound was killing her, and she knew it. "You're bleeding out," he said. His voice was a gravel road, unused and rough. "An hour, maybe 2, then it won't matter what you do to me." A flicker of surprise in her eyes. Or maybe it was respect. The youngest one, barely a woman, maybe 20, with medicine bundles tied to her belt, took a step forward. Her eyes, wide and dark, followed his gaze to the growing stain on her leader's shirt. The shadow spreading under her arm wasn't from the dim light. It was life seeping away into the cloth. "Ayanna," she whispered. The name was a prayer, a plea. The wounded woman, Ayanna, swayed, just for a second, but the rifle stayed locked on his heart. "I'm fine, Nayeli." She wasn't fine. Ezra had packed enough battlefield wounds with mud and prayer to recognize death when it came knocking. The third woman, her face a mask of hard lines and old hatreds, cradling a big Winchester like it was her firstborn child, she saw it too. "We should have killed him in his sleep, sister," she hissed. Her voice was like rocks grinding together. "Kiona speaks truth." But Nellie, the young healer, was already moving. Her fingers danced in the air near Ayanna's wound, not quite touching, as if reading a story written in pain. It was an old magic, a knowledge passed down through generations who'd learned to heal their own, because the world was busy trying to kill them. "She needs medicine," Nellie said, her voice trembling but firm. "Real medicine. The white man's medicine. The bullet is still inside." And just like that, Ezra felt the world shift. Power was a funny thing. It could change hands faster than a crooked gambler's shuffle. One moment you're at the end of a rope, the next you're the one holding the knot. "I have morphine," he said, the words coming out slow and steady. "I have surgical tools from my army days. Good steel." He let that sink in. "But you'll have to trust me enough to cut these ropes." Ayanna's laugh was a sharp, ugly sound, like glass breaking on stone. "Trust a white rancher? A man who sells his cattle to the forts that hunt us down like animals?" "Maybe," Ezra said, holding her gaze. "Or maybe you found a man who's been alone so long, he's forgotten which war he's supposed to be fighting." The truth was somewhere in the middle. Ezra had forgotten a lot in his 15 years of silence. He'd forgotten the taste of a woman's kiss, the sound of his own son's laughter. But he'd never forgotten the weight of a dying man in his arms. He'd never forgotten how fast a life could pour out of a hole no bigger than your thumb. Kiona didn't like it. She stepped forward, pressing the cold barrel of her Winchester against his temple. The metal was a shock against his skin. We could just take what we need. You could, Ezra agreed, his voice never wavering. He didn't even flinch. But your friend will be a ghost before you figure out which bottle is morphine and which one is horse liniment. It's your choice. Nally's hands were shaking now, not with fear, with rage. The rage of a healer watching a life slip through her fingers. She looked from Ayana's pale face to Ezra's calm one, and in that desperate moment, she made the choice that would change all their lives forever. Cut him loose. Nelly, no! Ayana's voice was fading, losing its sharp edge. She's right, Ezra said, his eyes locked on Ayana's. The fever was starting to take hold, making her gaze glassy and unfocused. I could have kept my mouth shut. Let you wonder. She'd be dead by noon. A single powerful question cut through Ayana's pain. Why? Ezra was quiet for a long time, the cabin filled with the sound of 3 women breathing and 1 old man remembering. He thought of his wife's grave, a simple wooden cross he'd carved himself. He thought of his son's last letter, the paper worn thin from 1,000 readings. He thought of all the wars, big and small, that had stolen the pieces of him he could never get back. Because I'm tired of burying people, he said. The rawhide ropes fell away. They moved Ayana to the big kitchen table, clearing away the tin plates and the half-empty bottle of whiskey. Ezra's hands, steady despite a lifetime of hard work and harder memories, laid out his tools on a clean cloth. A scalpel, forceps, a needle and thread. They gleamed like silver promises in the flickering lamplight. Nayeli will assist, Ayana managed to say through clenched teeth. Kiona, watch for soldiers. The young healer stood beside him. Her buckskin dress clung to her in the warm air of the cabin, the firelight catching the copper highlights in her long dark hair. When she leaned close to look at the wound, Ezra caught a scent. It wasn't just the clean smell of desert sage. It was something wilder, something that smelled like the open plains under a sky full of stars. You know medicine, she said. It wasn't a question. Battlefield surgery, he grunted. Not pretty, but it works. He passed her a clean cloth, and their hands brushed. The touch was electric, a jolt of life in the quiet, dusty cabin. It lasted only a second, but it felt like a lifetime. Her skin was warm, smooth as a stone pulled from a riverbed. She looked up, and their eyes met. And for the first time in 15 years, Ezra McKinnon felt something other than tired. It was dangerous territory. He'd been alone long enough to know the difference between simple hunger and this. This was something else. Not just the lonely ache of a man too long without a woman. It was a strange, unsettling feeling of recognition, like finding a piece of your own soul staring back at you from inside someone else's eyes. Wrong time, wrong woman, wrong damn world. Hold the light steady, he said, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. The bullet was lodged deep near her collarbone, a nasty spot. It hadn't killed her outright, but the infection would. It was already starting. He worked with a grim focus, his movements precise and economical. He was aware of Nayeli's soft breathing beside him, of the way she seemed to know what he needed before he did, her hands ready with a cloth or a clean instrument. You've done this before, he said, not looking up as she handed him the forceps. Apache women learn to heal our warriors. Her voice was soft, almost a song. While your people learn new ways to kill them. Some of my people, Ezra corrected, his focus entirely on the delicate work. Not all. The bullet came free with a sickening, wet pop. Ayana let out a sharp grunt, her knuckles white where she gripped the edge of the table, but she didn't scream. Tough as desert ironwood, that one. As Ezra began to stitch the wound closed, Nellie's quiet voice filled the space between them. Why do you live alone? Lost my family, he said, the words short and clipped. Wife to typhus, son to the war. He paused, the needle hovering over Ayana's skin. He considered how much of the truth a man should ever tell. Some men aren't meant for company. And some women, she replied, her voice barely a whisper, are not meant for reservations. Their eyes met again over the flickering lamp. And this time, there was no mistaking it. The hunger was there in her eyes, too. He saw it in the slight parting of her lips, in the way her pupils widened in the bright light. She was young enough to be his granddaughter, but the look she gave him was anything but innocent. It was a look of shared loneliness, of a deep and ancient sorrow that recognized its own reflection. "We should," he started to say, not even sure what would come next. But he never finished. Crack. A rifle shot ripped through the morning silence. Then another, closer this time. The cabin door burst open, and Kiona stood there, her Winchester leveled, her face a storm of fury and fear. "Soldiers! Half a mile out and coming fast!" Ayana struggled to sit up, a fresh bloom of red seeping through the new bandages. "How many?" "A dozen," Kiona spat. "Maybe more. And they've got Apache scouts with them, our own people, hunting us." Ezra's mind, sluggish for years, snapped into sharp focus. A dozen troopers wasn't a routine patrol. This was a manhunt, or in this case, a woman hunt. It meant someone had talked, or someone from that supply wagon raid had died badly, leaving a trail of blood and vengeance a blind man could follow. There was no time to think, only to act. "There's a root cellar," he said, his voice sharp and commanding. He was a sergeant again, barking orders in the heat of battle. "Under the floorboards by the stove. It's deep. It'll hide 3 people." "What about you?" Nellie asked, her eyes wide with a fear that was suddenly not for herself, but for him. Ezra was already moving, sweeping the bloody cloths and instruments off the table, kicking dirt over a bloodstain on the floor. "I'm a law-abiding cattle rancher," he said, his voice grim. "A man who sleeps heavy and hears nothing in the night." "They'll question you," Ayana said, her voice stronger now, the warrior overriding the patient. "They'll break you." Ezra stopped and met her fierce gaze. A faint, cold smile touched his lips. "Ma'am," he said, "I've been lying to the United States Army longer than you've been alive." The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, a drumbeat of approaching doom. Nellie's hand shot out and grabbed his arm, her fingers pressing into his weathered skin with a desperate urgency. "Why are you doing this? For us?" Ezra looked down at her, at this fierce, beautiful young woman who held the healing knowledge of a people being erased from the earth. The woman whose touch had reminded him that he was still a man, and not just a collection of ghosts. "Because," he said, his voice low and certain, "sometimes a man gets a second chance to decide what kind of man he really is." The floorboards settled back into place just as the first soldier rode into his yard. Lieutenant Morrison used to be Sergeant Morrison, back when Ezra was Corporal McKinnon. They were just boys then, full of piss and vinegar, young enough to believe that wars had winners. 30 years in the Arizona sun had baked all the boy out of Tom Morrison, leaving deep lines etched around his eyes like a map of every disappointment. "Ezra, you old son of a bitch," Morrison bellowed, swinging down from his horse with the easy grace of a man who'd spent his life in the saddle. "When's the last time you saw another human being out here?" "About as long as I can stand 'em, Tom," Ezra replied, pulling a pipe from his pocket and lighting it with hands that were shockingly steady. Beneath his feet, under the rough-hewn floorboards, 3 hearts beat a frantic, panicked rhythm, like trapped birds in a cage. "We're tracking raiders," Morrison said, getting straight to business. 3 Apache women, armed and extremely dangerous. Hit a supply wagon over near Dragoon Springs 2 days back. Ezra kept his face a perfect mask of disinterest. "3 women, you say?" "Don't let the skirts fool you," Morrison warned. "These ain't reservation squaws weaving baskets." One of them put a Winchester round clean through Corporal Henderson's shoulder, from 200 yards, in a crosswind. That would be Kiona, Ezra thought. He filed the information away. Another piece of a puzzle he didn't want to be solving. "Seen any tracks?" Morrison pressed, his eyes scanning the yard, the corral, the cabin. "Fresh horse sign? Anything out of the ordinary?" "Nothing but my own cattle and the usual rattlesnakes," Ezra said, taking a long, slow draw from his pipe. He blew a smoke ring that dissolved in the dry desert air. "What makes you think they'd come this way?" "Blood trail," Morrison said, his voice dropping. "One of them took a hit in that raid. A bad one, by the looks of it. Our scouts figure a medicine woman, desperate, might risk coming to a place like this, looking for a white man's supplies." Morrison's gaze settled on the cabin door. Those eyes, they missed nothing. 24 years of chasing ghosts through the canyons and mesas had taught him how to read signs other men couldn't even see. He could read the story of a broken twig, a misplaced stone. Could he read the lies on an old friend's face? Mind if we search the place, Ezra? It wasn't a question. It was an order wrapped in the thin cloth of old friendship. Help yourself, Ezra said with a shrug. Coffee's on the stove if you get thirsty. While a half-dozen soldiers tore his small cabin apart, turning over his mattress, emptying his cupboards, Ezra stood in his dooryard and let his mind drift. He remembered another choice, another lifetime. Gettysburg, July 1863. A Confederate kid couldn't have been more than 16, lying in the mud with his guts shot out, crying for his mama. Ezra could have walked by, should have. He was a Union soldier, and that boy was the enemy. But he hadn't walked by. He'd knelt in the blood and the mud, and he'd held that boy's hand as the life went out of him. Some choices you make, they don't just happen once. They echo. They keep happening over and over for the rest of your life. Found something, Lieutenant. The words cut through Ezra's memory like a knife. His blood ran cold. A young private, no older than that boy at Gettysburg, came out of the cabin. In his hand, he held a small, torn strip of buckskin. It was stained with dark, fresh blood, Ayanna's blood. Morrison took the piece of fabric, rubbing it between his thumb and forefinger. He sniffed it. This is fresh, he said, his eyes locking onto Ezra's. Apache work. No doubt about it. The world seemed to stop. The wind died. The buzzing of the flies went silent. The moment stretched, pulled as tight as a bowstring, ready to snap. Down below, in the suffocating darkness of the root cellar, 3 women held their breath, waiting for betrayal, waiting for death. Yep, Ezra said, the word coming out easy and slow. He took another puff of his pipe. Took that off a dead coyote yesterday morning. Been meaning to use it to patch my saddle. A coyote? Morrison's voice was sharp with disbelief. Mangy-ridden thing, Ezra went on, his voice a low, convincing drawl. Looked half-starved, wandered right up to the water trough. Figured I'd put it out of its misery. The hide was worthless, but I thought that little bit of beadwork was worth saving. It was a good lie, a simple lie. The kind of lie a lonely man in the desert might actually live. Ezra's voice carried the casual, unshakable authority of a man who was just stating the simple facts of his day. Morrison stared at his old sergeant's face, searching for a flicker, a twitch, a single sign of deception. He found nothing but the calm, weathered mask Ezra had worn for 15 years. Still, the doubt lingered in his eyes. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so his men couldn't hear. Ezra, he said, his voice tight, if you're hiding something from me— Tom, Ezra said, using his first name like a shield, a reminder of the bonds forged in cannon smoke and shared canteens. Let's be sensible. If I had 3 armed Apache warriors hiding in my root cellar, would I be standing here jawing with you? Or would I be halfway to Mexico by now? A slow grin spread across Morrison's face, cracking the sun-baked mask. He let out a short, sharp laugh. Fair point, you old bastard. Fair point. They searched for another hour, their boots thumping on the floorboards directly above the hidden women. They found nothing. The soldiers grew restless, eager to be on the move, to leave the oppressive silence of this lonely ranch behind. As they mounted up, ready to ride out, Morrison paused beside his horse. He looked at Ezra, and for a moment the lieutenant was gone, and it was just Tom, the boy from Ohio. You ever get lonely out here, Ezra? Every damn day, Tom. You know there's a place for you at Fort Bowie. A pension. Easy work. Hell, there's a place for you anywhere a man's needed. You saved my life at Cold Harbor, you know. I never forgot that. You don't have to live like this. Ezra looked past him, out at the vast, empty expanse of the desert that had become his only companion. It was a harsh, unforgiving beauty. Mountains like the broken teeth of some ancient god. A sky so big it could swallow a man's soul and never even notice. This is what I choose, he said. After the dust from the soldiers' horses had settled, after the world had returned to its deep, profound silence, Ezra stood and listened. He listened for a long, long time. Then he walked back to the stove and lifted the loose floorboard. Three faces, pale in the gloom, looked up at him. Ayana's eyes were different now. The suspicion was gone, replaced by a hard-won respect. Kiona's expression was unreadable, but she had lowered her Winchester, and Nayeli, her face was soft, warm, lit with an emotion that Ezra didn't dare put a name to. Why? Ayana asked. It was the second time she'd asked him that. This time Ezra had a real answer. Because my government made a promise to your people, he said, his voice low and heavy. And then they broke it. I was one of the men in a blue uniform who helped them break it. Maybe it's too late to fix that, but it's not too late to stop being a part of the lie. He looked at Nellie. Some things are worth more than a man's safety. Kiona, ever the practical one, was already checking the action on her rifle. They'll be back. That officer, he didn't believe you. Not all the way. He'll be back, but not for a while, Ezra agreed. But she's right. You can't stay here. Ayana nodded, pulling herself to her feet. The surgery had taken its toll, but the fire in her eyes burned as bright as ever. We leave at sunset. We were heading for the Mexican border. Can you get us there? Ezra looked around his small, dusty cabin, at the life he had built, or rather, the life he had hidden in. To leave now would be to abandon it all. The cattle, the ranch, the quiet solitude he had thought he wanted more than anything. It would mean stepping back into the world he had run away from, a world of choices, of consequences, of other people, a world of pain, and a world of life. He looked at Nayeli. He saw the way the firelight danced in her dark eyes, the quiet strength in her healer's hands. He saw a future he had long ago given up on, a future that was infinitely more dangerous and infinitely more precious than the empty peace he had found here. I know a way, he said, a hard way, but they won't find us. They rode out under a blanket of stars so thick and bright it looked like God himself had spilled a bag of diamonds across the black velvet sky. Four silent shadows moving through the moon-drenched sagebrush. They were heading south towards a line on a map that meant freedom for some and a final bitter exile for others. Ezra led them on winding deer trails and forgotten miners' paths, routes he had discovered in his 15 years of wandering this lonely land. He knew the canyons that would hide them from cavalry patrols, the secret springs where they could water their horses without leaving a trace. He had packed his spare horse with enough food and water for a week of hard travel. At the Rio Grande, he told himself, they would go their separate ways. He would turn back and they would disappear into Mexico. It would be over. But he knew deep down that was another lie. Ayana rode tall, her back straight, refusing to show any sign of the pain from her wound. She was a chief, and she would not show weakness. Kiona rode point, her Winchester cradled in her arms, her eyes scanning every shadow, trusting nothing. She was the guardian, the protector, the unsleeping wolf. But Nayeli, she rode beside Ezra, so close that their legs brushed against each other when the trail narrowed, sending a jolt through him every time. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of unspoken questions, of feelings too new and too dangerous to name. As they paused to rest the horses in a hidden arroyo, she finally spoke. You never told me about your son. Ezra stared into the small fire he'd built, watching the flames dance. His name was Samuel. He was a good boy, better than me. He had his mother's heart, gentle. He picked up a stick and poked at the embers. When the war started, he was full of fire, believed in the Union, in freeing the slaves, believed in the promises. And the war took him? She asked softly. The war takes everything, Ezra said. But then he hesitated. There was more to the story, a part he hadn't spoken aloud in 20 years. He didn't die at Gettysburg. Not really. He was wounded, sent home. But the boy who came back, he wasn't my son anymore. The light had gone out of his eyes. He saw what the war was really about. Not freedom, money, land, power. Ezra looked up, his eyes meeting hers in the firelight. He hated what he'd become, what we'd all become. One day he just left, headed west, sent one letter from Santa Fe, said he was looking for a place where a man could still be a man, where promises weren't just words. That was the last I ever heard from him. Nellie was silent for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. This raid, she said, changing the subject, but Ezra had the feeling it was all connected. It wasn't just for supplies. Morrison said you hit a wagon. A military payroll wagon, Ayana said, speaking from the other side of the fire. Her voice was strong. The healing had begun. But it carried something else. Something they stole from our people years ago. The Star Bundle. Ezra had heard whispers of it. An old Apache legend. A medicine bundle so powerful it could heal the sick, bring the rain, and show the future. He'd thought it was just a story. It's real, Nayeli said, her eyes burning with intensity. It holds the health of our people. A sickness has come to our families in the Sierra Madre. A coughing sickness that takes the children and the old ones. Our healers say the sickness came because the heart of our people was stolen, because the Star Bundle is gone. Suddenly the stakes were 1,000 times higher. They weren't just fugitives running for their lives. They were on a sacred quest. They were carrying the last hope of a dying nation. And Ezra McKinnon, the man who wanted nothing to do with the world, was right in the middle of it. This changes things, he said quietly. Yes, Ayana agreed. It means Morrison will not stop. That bundle is a symbol. To the army, it is a trophy of their victory over us. They will not let it go. They will hunt us to the gates of hell. As if summoned by her words, Kiona, who had been scouting the ridge above them, slid silently back into camp. Riders, she whispered, her voice tight as a drum. 2 of them. Not soldiers. Apache. Ezra grabbed his rifle. Scouts for Morrison? Kiona shook her head. No, the sign is wrong. They ride like hunters, like wolves. She looked at Ayana, her eyes dark with a new kind of fear. It is Chaco. The name dropped into the camp like a stone. Ayana's face hardened. Nayeli let out a small, involuntary gasp. Chaco? Ezra asked. He was one of us, Ayana explained, her voice laced with venom. But he believes the old ways are dead. He works for the Americans now, hunting down his own people for money. He believes the power of the Star Bundle should belong to him alone. He wants to be a king. So they weren't just being hunted from behind. They were being hunted from the front too. They were caught in a closing vice. How did he know we had the bundle? Ezra asked. He must have had a spy at Dragoon Springs, Ayana said. He knew we would make a move for it. He was waiting. They had to move, now. They smothered the fire and mounted their horses, plunging back into the darkness. But the night was no longer their friend. It was full of enemies. The air itself seemed to hum with danger. They rode for hours, pushing the horses hard, their ears straining for any sound of pursuit. Just before dawn, as they were navigating a narrow rock-strewn canyon, it happened. An ambush. 2 rifle shots echoed from the canyon rim above. Ezra's horse screamed and went down, throwing him hard against the rocks. Pain exploded in his shoulder as he hit the ground. Before he could even get his bearings, a figure was on him, a knife flashing in the moonlight. It was Chaco. He was bigger than Ezra, younger, faster. His face was a mask of brutal triumph. But Ezra was a survivor. He rolled hard, kicking out, and managed to get his own knife free. The 2 men grunted and struggled in the dust, a deadly, silent dance. Out of the corner of his eye, Ezra saw Kiona engage the second man, her rifle and his trading shots in the dark. Ayana, weak as she was, had taken cover behind a rock, firing her own rifle to support Kiona. But Ezra's fight was more personal. Chaco was strong, fueled by greed and rage. He pressed his advantage, forcing Ezra back. The tip of his knife pricked Ezra's throat. The bundle, old man, he snarled. Give it to me, and I'll let you die quickly. Go to hell, Ezra gasped, straining against the pressure. Suddenly, a new figure appeared. It was Nellie. In her hand, she held a heavy rock. With a cry that was part fear and part fury, she brought it down on the side of Chaco's head. He grunted, stunned, his grip loosening for just a second. It was all the opening Ezra needed. He twisted, reversing their positions, and drove his own blade home. Chaco's eyes went wide with surprise, and then he collapsed. The second man, seeing his leader fall, broke and ran, disappearing into the darkness with Kiona's bullets chasing him. Silence returned to the canyon. It was a heavy, ragged silence, broken only by the sound of their own harsh breathing. Ezra staggered to his feet, his shoulder screaming in protest. Nellie rushed to his side, her hands gently probing the injury. "It is dislocated," she said, her voice shaking. "We must set it." But Kiona wasn't looking at him. She was staring down at her own side. In the growing light of dawn, they could all see the dark stains spreading across her buckskin shirt. During the firefight, she'd been hit. Now they had two wounded warriors. Their horses were exhausted. Their supplies were running low. And Morrison, relentless and stubborn, was somewhere behind them, getting closer with every passing hour. The hope they had felt just a day ago was draining away, leaving behind the cold, hard certainty of their fate. They were trapped, and the desert was a patient killer. "There is a place," Nellie said, her voice a thin thread of hope in the grim silence. "An old mission, San Javier. It is hidden in the hills, forgotten by most. The priest there, he helps our people sometimes. It is a risk, but Kiona needs more than my herbs can offer." Ezra looked at the warrior woman. Kiona was trying to hide it, but she was pale, her breathing shallow. She was bleeding internally. Without real help, she wouldn't last the day. "How far?" Ezra asked, gritting his teeth as Nellie began to wrap his shoulder. "A day's ride," she said, "if we push hard." "Then we ride," Ayana said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "We ride, or we die here." Ezra knew the mission. San Javier del Bac, a beautiful old ghost of a place, a relic from a time when the Spanish thought they could conquer this land with crosses instead of rifles. He also knew it was directly in the path of Morrison's patrol route. Going there wasn't just a risk, it was a suicide mission. But looking at Kiona's pale face, and then at the fierce determination in Nellie's eyes, he knew they had no other choice. They had to walk, leading the exhausted horses. Every step was agony for Ezra and Kiona. The sun beat down on them, a merciless hammer in a brazen sky. The world shimmered with heat, and the mountains in the distance looked like mocking, unattainable dreams. They reached the mission just as the sun was setting, casting long purple shadows across the valley. It was quiet, peaceful, a sanctuary from the violent world outside. An old man with a face as wrinkled as a dried apple and eyes as kind as a summer rain met them at the gate. He was Father Miguel. He took one look at Kiona, at Ezra's arm in its sling, and ushered them inside without a single question. He was a man who had lived his life on the border between worlds, and he knew sorrow when he saw it. Inside the cool adobe walls of the infirmary, as the priest cleaned and stitched Kiona's wound with surprising skill, Nellie tended to Ezra. She worked in silence, her touch gentle but firm as she popped his shoulder back into place. The pain was blinding, but the relief that followed was immense. As she finished wrapping it, her fingers lingered on his skin. "You fought like a warrior," she said softly. "I fought like a man who had something to lose," he replied, his voice hoarse. Later that evening, after Kiona was resting as comfortably as possible, Father Miguel brought them a simple meal of bread and stew. He sat with Ezra in the mission courtyard, under the cool gaze of the stars. "You are a long way from home, my son," the priest said, his voice gentle. "I don't have a home," Ezra said. "Everyone has a home," the priest corrected. "Sometimes we just forget the way back." He was quiet for a moment, studying Ezra's face in the moonlight. "You have the eyes of a man I once knew, a young man, full of a different kind of fire. He came here many years ago, seeking something. Peace, I think. His name was Samuel." Ezra's heart stopped. The world tilted on its axis. "Samuel," he whispered. "My son's name was Samuel. He had your eyes," the priest continued, a sad smile on his lips. "He stayed here for a time. He learned the Apache ways, their language. He wanted to build a bridge between our worlds. He believed peace was possible." "What? What happened to him?" Ezra could barely get the words out. "He rode into the Sierra Madre with a Chiricahua leader, trying to negotiate a treaty with the Mexican government. It was a betrayal. They were ambushed by renegades. Men like this Chaco you speak of. Men who profit from war." The priest looked at Ezra, his eyes full of a deep shared sorrow. "He died bravely, my son. He died fighting for a people that were not his own, but who he had come to love. The Apache honor him still. They call him he who walks between worlds." The words hit Ezra with the force of a physical blow. his son, his gentle boy. He hadn't just disappeared. He had found his purpose. He had died a warrior's death, not in a blue uniform fighting for a lie, but here, in this vast, cruel, beautiful land, fighting for something real. Nally had come to stand in the doorway, listening. She stepped into the courtyard, her face softened by a sorrow that was not her own. "Our elders still tell the story of your son," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He is a legend among our people, a symbol of what could be." This was no longer about helping three strangers. It was about his son. It was about honoring the man Samuel had become. This journey, this fight, it was his son's legacy, and now it was his. He felt a profound sense of peace settle over him, a clarity he hadn't felt in decades. He finally knew what he was supposed to do. He wasn't just running from his past anymore. He was running towards his son's future. But peace in this land was a fleeting thing. The next morning, as the first light of dawn painted the sky, the sound they had all been dreading returned. The rhythmic thunder of horses' hooves. A lookout, one of the Pima Indians who lived at the mission, ran into the courtyard, his eyes wide with panic. "Soldiers! The bluecoats are coming!" Morrison. He had found them. "Found. There is a crypt," Father Miguel said, his voice calm in the face of chaos. "Beneath the chapel. It is small, but it will hide you. Go, quickly." They scrambled into the dark, musty space, pulling a heavy stone slab over the entrance, just as the sound of boots echoed in the courtyard above. The air in the crypt was thick with the dust of ages, the smell of dirt and decay. They were in a tomb, and it felt like their own. They could hear Morrison's voice, muffled but clear, questioning the priest. Father Miguel's voice was calm, steady, denying everything. He was a good man, a brave man, but Morrison was not a man to be trifled with. He was a bloodhound, and he had the scent. "My scout tracked them this far, Father." Morrison's voice was hard, edged with impatience. "A man with a dislocated shoulder and a woman shot in the side don't just vanish into thin air. They're here. I know they're here." A long silence followed. In the darkness of the crypt, Ezra could feel Nayeli's hand find his. Her grip was tight, a small point of warmth and life in the cold, dead dark. Then they heard a new voice, a softer voice, speaking in a mix of Apache and broken English. It was Morrison's scout. "Lieutenant," the voice said, "the tracks, they lead away, towards the mountains. Fresh tracks, from before dawn." Another pause. Ezra's heart hammered against his ribs. "All right." Morrison's voice was full of frustration. "Mount up. They've got a head start, but they're on foot now. We'll run them down by noon." The sounds of the soldiers faded away. They had been given a reprieve, a miracle. But Ezra knew better. It wasn't a miracle. It was a lie. The scout had lied to his commander. Why? After what felt like an eternity, Father Miguel slid the stone slab aside, his face grim. "He is gone," he said, "but he will be back. The scout, a man named Taza, he bought you some time. He is of Nayeli's clan. He recognized her sign. He risked his life for you." The betrayal was no longer just Ezra's. It was spreading, a crack in the foundation of Morrison's world. "You must go," the priest urged. "Taza sent you a gift, but it will not last forever. Follow the river north into the canyons. It will be the last place Morrison thinks to look. From there, you can cut south again, towards the border." It was a desperate gamble, a long, dangerous detour, but it was their only chance. They left the sanctuary of the mission, plunging back into the wilderness. The chase was on again, but this time, it felt different. It was personal. Morrison wasn't just hunting Apache raiders anymore. He was hunting his old friend, Ezra McKinnon, the man who had lied to his face, the man who had chosen the enemy over his own kind. For 2 days they scrambled through the rocky, unforgiving canyons, following the winding path of the river. It was a brutal, exhausting journey. Kiona's wound had reopened, and she was weak with fever. Ezra's whole body ached, but they pushed on, driven by an instinct for survival that was stronger than pain, stronger than fear. On the third day they found a place to rest, a small, hidden cave behind a waterfall. It was there, in the cool green twilight of the cave, that the tension that had been simmering between Ezra and Nayeli finally broke. She was tending to his shoulder, her touch sending fire through his veins. He looked at her, at the strength and the sorrow and the impossible beauty in her face, and he knew he couldn't hide from it any longer. Nayeli, he said, his voice a rough whisper. She looked up, her dark eyes searching his, and then he leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was desperate, hungry, a lifetime of loneliness and grief poured into a single moment. It was the kiss of two people who had nothing left to lose, who had found each other at the end of the world. She kissed him back with a fierce passion that matched his own, her fingers tangling in his graying hair. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. "My people have a story," she whispered, her forehead resting against his. "About the spirits of the mountain and the river. They were not meant to be together. Their worlds were too different. But their love was so strong that they shook the foundations of the earth and created a new world where they could be one." Ezra knew then that he would never go back. His old life was a ghost, a dream he was finally waking up from. His home was not a dusty ranch in Arizona. It was here, with this woman. Whatever happened, they would face it together. But the world they were trying to build was a fragile thing, and the old world was not finished with them yet. As they emerged from the canyons and turned south again, they could see the dust cloud on the horizon. Morrison. He was like a force of nature, a relentless storm that would not be denied. Taza's deception had been discovered, and now Morrison's hunt was fueled by a cold, personal fury. The final push to the border was a desperate, harrowing race against time. They were exhausted, on the brink of collapse, running on nothing but sheer willpower. The dust cloud behind them grew larger, closer. They could hear the faint sound of a bugle call, a chilling promise of the vengeance that was coming for them. The Rio Grande. They could see it, a silver ribbon shimmering in the distance. Freedom. It was so close they could taste it. But just as they reached the riverbank, a line of blue-coated soldiers appeared on the ridge ahead of them, blocking their path. And from behind, Morrison and his troopers thundered down upon them. They were trapped, cornered, the end of the line. Morrison rode forward, his face a thunderous mask of betrayal. He stopped his horse 20 yards from Ezra. The two old friends faced each other across a battlefield that was decades in the making. "It's over, Ezra." Morrison's voice was flat, devoid of all emotion. "Give me the women. Give me the bundle. You can walk away. I'll tell them you were their prisoner. No one has to know." It was a last chance, a final offer of mercy, born from a friendship that was now nothing but ashes. Ezra looked at Nayeli, at the fierce, unyielding pride in Nyana's eyes, at the warrior spirit still burning in the wounded Kiona. He looked at the sacred bundle Nellie clutched to her chest. He thought of his son, Samuel, who had died for these people, for this hope. He turned back to Morrison, and his voice was clear and strong, ringing out across the riverbank. "No!" The single word hung in the air, a final act of defiance. "Damn you, Ezra," Morrison whispered, his face twisting in a knot of pain and anger. "Damn you to hell!" He raised his hand, ready to give the order to fire. This was it, the end. But then, something impossible happened. Taza, the Apache scout, who had been sitting on his horse just behind Morrison, suddenly raised his own rifle. But he didn't point it at Ezra. He pointed it directly at Lieutenant Morrison. "My sister will cross the river," Taza said, his voice calm and deadly. "You will let them pass." Sister. Nayeli was his sister. Morrison stared at his scout, his face a picture of disbelief and shock. In that moment of hesitation, chaos erupted. Taza fired his rifle into the air. Several of the other Apache scouts, emboldened by his courage, did the same. The soldiers, confused, unsure who to shoot, milled in a panic. "Go!" Ezra yelled. "Now!" He half-carried, half-dragged Kiona into the river, with Ayana and Nayeli right beside him. The water was cold, the current strong, but they pushed forward, fighting their way towards the Mexican shore. Bullets zipped past them, kicking up plumes of water, but the soldiers' fire was disorganized, panicked. Taza and the loyal scouts were providing a desperate, heroic covering fire, holding back the tide of vengeance just long enough. They stumbled onto the far bank, gasping for air, dripping and exhausted, but alive. They had made it. On the other side of the river, the brief rebellion was over. Taza and the other scouts were surrounded, prisoners now. Morrison sat on his horse, defeated, staring across the water at the man who had once been his friend. He had won the battle, but he had lost something far more important. As the sun began to set, painting the river in shades of blood and gold, Ayanna clasped Ezra's hand, warrior to warrior. "You are no longer a white man to us," she said. "You are a brother." Kiona, weak but alive, gave him a curt nod. From her, it was the highest praise. But Nellie lingered. She came to him, her eyes shining with tears and something more. "Taza, he gave his life for us. He gave his life for hope," Ezra said, his voice thick with emotion. "My brother is gone," she said, her voice breaking. "But my people have found a new brother." She reached out and touched the graying hair at his temples. "Your son, he who walks between worlds, his spirit is with us now. But his father is with us in the flesh. There is a home for you in the Sierra Madre, Ezra McKinnon, a place where promises are kept, a place where you will never be lonely again." She didn't have to ask. He wasn't choosing between safety and the unknown. He was choosing between death and life. He watched as Ayanna and Kiona began their journey south, towards the mountains, towards home. Then he turned to Nellie. He took her hand, and their fingers intertwined. Ezra McKinnon took one last look back at the Arizona territory, at the ghosts and the grief he was leaving behind. Then he turned his horse south and rode with her towards a future he could not yet see, but a future he could finally truly choose. What would you have done in his place? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story of courage and redemption in the Untamed West, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more. You won't want to miss what's coming next.